Real quick before we jump into the video, guys, for the rest of this year I'm going to be on a fundraising campaign to raise a minimum of £1,000 for the Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. For more information on the charity and what it does, and for the donation links, please look in the description below. And thank you all for your continued support. Enjoy the show. What's going on, guys? Rivalry Teacher now, and we are back for RBL Season 2. The Royal Bournemouth Rebombies are here after being beaten in the final last season. And oh boy, this is going to be a fun one. So the draft format was a little different this time round. We had a slight adjustments to the tier list, etc. We've also moved from an 8-coach league to a 12-coach league. So we've got a very interesting position. This team is probably my favorite team I've ever drafted, not gonna lie. We drafted some really fun and interesting Pokemon this time round, and boy oh boy can I not wait to play this one out. So of course last season we unfortunately lost out in the finals to Ben Zossam, but we're back, we're hoping to get our revenge, and I think this team can take us one step better. So, with all that being said, so we were fortunate enough to be first pick in the draft, which is actually really interesting. It's kind of an awkward spot as well, because being first pick in a VGC draft makes a lot of things a little complicated, because after your first pick, you're not picking for another 22 picks, so a lot of power is going off the table, right? You know, and that can be very scary. So I wanted a first pick that kind of didn't limit my options as best as possible, gave me a lot of things to try to draft around. So I first picked Thundurus. Now, Thundurus is a very fun Pokemon in the format. In Series 7 meta, it actually didn't get the best usage in the world. I think it was like 18th in usage stats, which is pretty darn low, has to be said. But this thing is actually super interesting. It has two really good abilities. I have Prankster on the screen, but it also has Defiant as well, which can be very fun for physically offensive sets. But this thing gets a very wide move pool, everything from offensive on both physical and special side, to very good support moves as well. So this gives me a very wide-ranging Pokemon that can fit in a lot of different teams. Obviously its speed tier helps it out a lot, it's very quick in the format, which makes it nice, and it has pretty serviceable defensive stats as well. Commonly it's been seen running physical as a max target, running Assault Vest, to like pack up that Spadef problem. But it can run a lot of different sets, and I think that's super exciting to try and draft around. And definitely a very strong first pick in the draft. And so, after that, we wait. We wait for a while, and a lot of picks that were there are unsurprisingly gone. Things like the Urshifu's went immediately afterwards, and things like Whimsicott got picked up, which is not a surprise. G-Max Cinderace got picked up. What a surprise. We have Matt Flame in the draft. Shouldn't be too surprised about that. But yeah, a lot of power went off the table. Things like Tapu Fini went, Tapu Lele went on the way back to me as well. Lots of really interesting picks got picked up. But one pick that I think slept under the radar for me, and it's a pick that I think is very underrated, but again, it's one of those fringe picks in the usage stats, is Pheromosa. And Pheromosa, oh boy, this thing could be super exciting to play around. This thing, as you can see by the base stats on the screen, is insanely fast. At 151 base speed, the only thing that's faster than this Pokemon in the format, aside from Scarfers, is Regieleki. But even after a +1 speed, or just rocking a Choice Scarf, this thing outspeeds Regieleki as well. Which is pretty disgusting, has to be said. And of course, combine that with its insanely heavy offensive stats. Much like Thundurus, it can be very versatile, can be physical or special, or even support for that matter. It does get some tech moves like Speed Boost, for example. Speed Swap, rather. Which is pretty fun. Obviously, the biggest problem with Pheromosa is defensively it's made of twigs, which is ironic, because it's literally a stick insect Pokemon. But, yeah. It doesn't really bother me too much. Obviously, this does create a pretty important weakness, which is priority. But alongside this pick in the draft, we picked up the exact counter to priority, which is Indeedee Male. Now, people actually did ask me about this pick during the draft. People reached out to me and asked me why I picked Indeedee Male and not Indeedee Female here. The reason I opted for Indeedee Male is because Indeedee Male is sitting in tier 2, and it's the more offensive of the two Indeedees. Obviously, Indeedee Female doesn't hit as hard, but has a lot more special defense, which makes it better as a follow-me style user, but it does limit its offensive capability. Whereas Indeedee Male, sitting in tier 2, is more offensive. It's got 20 base higher special attack, 10 base SPDF lower, but also 10 highest base speed. So this thing could also function offensively as well as defensively, which makes this very scary. But the main priority reason that I drafted this was for Psychic Surge. Now, with the 3 points in the draft being 400, this did give me the option to draft 2 additional tier 1s, not just one. Thunderous being a tier 1 pick, of course, and Pheromosa also being a tier 1 pick. So Indeedee Male, sitting in my tier 2 slot, covers the same things that I would have wanted Indeedee Female for, but for a better value pick. So I opted for that instead. And this left the door open for me to potentially pick another tier 1 if I wanted to, depending on how the draft was going. Because the draft was going pretty quick pace. A lot of people were making their picks relatively snappy. And because of that, there was a lot of very interesting picks going up. And after this pick in the draft, we've already got a really good synergy because the things that Thunderous and Indeedee don't want to take on, Pheromosa kind of bodies with its fighting moves. You know, Thunderous doesn't want to take the Rock and Ice moves. Indeedee doesn't want to take the Dark moves. Well, Pheromosa kind of bodies all of those. The only thing we haven't necessarily covered for is Fairy. Although Thunderous does get Sludge Wave and stuff like that, Pheromosa gets Poison Jab. So it's not like I can't cover for Fairy with these 3. But it is a bit of a bind. And that is something that I wanted to consider patching up moving forward in the draft. We do actually patch this up a little bit later, but not in this rotation of the draft. So, once again, 22 picks have gone, and a lot of people, interestingly enough, were picking up things like Weather Cores. There was some Trick Room ones coming up. I know Ben Zossam drafted Dusclops at this point, and there was quite a few options sitting there that I kind of liked the look of. And one duo that I did see, which is kind of a bit of a throwback to Generation 7, is Torkoal and Lilligant. And, oh man, I am super excited for these picks. Let's talk about Torkoal first. So, Torkoal, of course, being very, very slow, allows it to function in Trick Room, which is what Indeedee gives you, which is nice. It also functions extremely well with Speed Swap on Pheromosa, turning it into a 150 base speed Pokemon is kind of exciting, given how much damage the thing does with its Drought ability and Sun. Very, very scary. Sunmon, of course, that defense stat is exceptionally good. It allows it to take hits pretty comfortably, even from things like Urshifu and stuff like that. It can actually live some of the crits, depending on what spread I run, which is definitely an exciting option to bring forward going into this one. And, of course, the fact that it does bring Sun can really cuck the Rain users, and it also cucks one Hell user. Someone did draft Alola Ninetales, I forget who did now. But yeah. Weather is always a difficult one, because Weather Wars are very heavily skill matchup based. So I back myself to win skill matchups in a lot of cases, because I've been playing for a long time, whereas a lot of players in this league are either new or relatively new. So I would back myself to win skill matchups. But it doesn't make this any less scary. It has really nice synergies with the rest of my team as well. I can support it pretty easily with the rest of my team that I've already picked. So this is already pretty interesting. And then we paired it up with Lilligant, of course, the classic Sun Sweeper from 2017-2018 VGC. Lilligant got a lot of usage as a Sun Sweeper thanks to Chlorophyll, of course, especially when you pair it up with that 110 special attack stat. This thing does also get access to Quiver Dance, so even if I'm not running Sun, this thing could actually be pretty scary. I can just set up a Quiver Dance and potentially pair that up with a Max Airstream from Thunderous. And this thing's already pretty fast, it's already bulky, and it hits pretty darn hard with that 110 special attack. It can actually be pretty scary. So this thing gets a lot of cool moves as well, so definitely something that I'm excited to try out. I think it does get a couple of surprising tech moves. I don't want to talk too much about them in case I actually do opt to bring them. It does also get things like Aromatherapy, which are not necessarily the best in the world, but it does get Growth, which is exceptionally good in Sun. It can definitely allow me to run mix sets. Gets Helping Hand as well, so if I want to run this more of a supportive Sun set, I can. Does get Sleep Powder as well. So it gets a lot of things that I can interestingly play around. Funny enough, it does actually get Grassy Glide, but its attack stat's not high enough to actually deal with that. But yeah, it gets a lot of good moves that I can play around, and I'm excited to give this little Lilligant a go. I've not actually used Lilligant in a while. Like, I used it very briefly in Gen 7, but it very quickly fell off for me as I started to use Exeggutor more, which incidentally, I almost picked Exeggutor up. I did consider it, because obviously it does pair up with the Psychic Terrain with Indeedee, but the problem is the quad bug weakness kind of bothered me a little bit, I think, and also the fact Exeggutor isn't as fast as Lilligant, if I remember right. I think it's actually slower. I'm just going to check that just to make sure I haven't messed that up. Yeah, Exeggutor's only base 55 speed, so it's a lot slower. Albeit it is a little bit higher on the special attack side at 125 and is better on the physical attack as well with 95 attack. But the problem is that speed tier means that even with the chlorophyll, it is still outsped by things like Thunderous and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's a bit of a problem. So I opted for Lilligant for that reason. I wanted the extra speed. Because, you know, 15 special attack is not that huge of a difference. It can definitely matter and can definitely be the difference between one-shots and not. But the fact that this thing hits incredibly hard, and yes, it is a little bit more one-dimensional, but for the trade-off of being pure grass type, so I'm not as weak to bug and other types, this definitely helps us out a lot. And this does give us some nice checks to the ground type as well. Obviously, with Torkoal being weak to ground, and our only ground resist comes from the Thundy at the moment because it's an immunity. Having a ground resist, always kind of nice. So, with this 5, we've pretty much rounded out our offensive core of the team. Obviously, all 5 of these can be offensive. All 5 of these have defensive or support options, which makes this very versatile and kind of hard to prep for because you never quite know which is going to be the carry. So for the rest of the draft, I was kind of looking at patches and things that I could do to this team to kind of round out the supportive move pool. Oh, and you'll notice at this point in the draft, I have not picked my Gmax. Part of the reason for that is because it wasn't necessarily a Gmax that I super wanted. Obviously, I knew a lot of the Gmaxes were going to go, the more popular ones like the Charizards, Rotten Tomatoes in the draft, so he was obviously going to go for Venusaur, and stuff like that. So there were definitely some picks that I would have potentially considered, but I didn't want to prioritize them high enough because I feel like these 5 picks for me were way higher priority. Particularly with Torkoal sitting in Tier 1 and Lilligant sitting in Tier 3, this gave me a pretty good option for value. This does mean, of course, that I couldn't draft things like Milotic and stuff like that, which is one thing I would have drafted if I had the opportunity to, but I opted against that. But one pick that I didn't opt against, and it's the only pick that was returning from my draft of last season, is going to be Dragloak. So, Dragloak is a pretty cool Pokemon. Obviously, it doesn't get the same move pool that Dragapult does, but that 102 base speed is actually very important because it does still get some of the supportive moves that Dragapult gets. And its attack stat isn't terrible. At 80 attack, it can still do meaningful damage, but it's not really designed to be offensive. But it does get things like Ally Switch, which can be annoying. I believe it gets Thunder Wave, if I remember right. Was that the move I was looking for the other day? I forgot. Pretty sure it's Thunder Wave. Yeah, Thunder Wave was what I was looking for. And a lot of it, it can be a trapper with Infestation and stuff like that. It does get Sucker Punch, which I actually forgot about. But it does still get some decent moves. It does get some of the move pools that Dragapult gets, it just doesn't get all of them. So that's the thing with this one. But even then, Breaking Swipe is still a pretty solid utility move. It's become Rhycoustic's favorite move. And it's good reason. It drops the attack stat of both opposing Pokemon, which can be pretty obnoxious. There's definitely some fun shenanigans that this little guy can do. But yeah, largely for supportive move pool, this thing is actually really interesting to use. Which is why I wanted to pick it up again, because sitting in Tier 4, this actually feels like such a good value pick. I might have even considered this as a Tier 3 pick. Maybe not, but this would have been a consideration nonetheless. And given the fact there wasn't that many Tier 4 picks that I particularly wanted, it's worth pointing out this thing gets Helping Hand as well, which I actually didn't realize it got. I've just seen that on my other screen. But yeah, I really like this. Does have some nice abilities. Clear Body, of course, preventing stat drops is Always nice. You never really want your stats getting dropped if you can avoid it, particularly from max moves like Max Darkness and stuff like that. Having no stat drops is always handy. This also means that I can't have my speed dropped, which definitely helps out a lot as well, because that 102 speed outspeeds things like Regigigas, for example. The fact that I can pack Will-O-Wisp on this thing definitely helps that out. So, Dracloak, pretty nice utility, pretty nice support Pokemon. Can really glue this team together really well. Particularly if I want to defend against max options. I really don't want some of my things taking max moves, for example. So if I can throw a Dracloak in there and just prevent my opponent from getting their max move into the priority target, then we're in a pretty good spot. So yeah, it's a pretty fun move pool. It has Grudge, which is a move I really want to try out. I don't think it's that great, but it could be really interesting. But we'll see. Oh yeah. Fun little move Pokemon, definitely a worthwhile move pool, and definitely a worthwhile pickup. Pretty good value for tier 4 in my opinion. So I still had a tier 3 pick left up, and at this point in the draft, I still didn't have a Steel type. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with Steel, because I do like having bulky Steels on my team. Sitting in tier 3 still, Aggron was still up. A couple of other picks were up, like Kling Klang, which were very, very niche picks that I don't think I would have drafted myself. But one pick that was still up there was Steelix, and that's why we drafted it. So, Steelix with an insane amount of physical bulk and actually somewhat passable special bulk actually makes this a very interesting mod. Of course, being very slow as well, it functions nicely as a Trick Room option for Indeedee, which definitely helps us out. Does also get moves like Curse as well, so I can slow myself down even more, pick up the Gyro Ball for damage, and also buff up my defense for things like Body Press. Pretty standard move pool. There's not too much too complicated with Steelix. But yeah, it's a really fun Pokemon. I've not actually used it that much in doubles. Sturdy's a nice ability for it as well. It definitely helps it out a little bit. Just to guarantee that I live a hit. Particularly from water moves. So having the option to just live that hit is always nice. It means I can invest it a little bit in other items rather than just run Focus Sash. So, yeah, a lot of good picks here. Very good defensive pick. Obviously, this is always nice. As you know, I drafted Ferrothorn last season, so I do like my bulky Steels. They definitely give me a lot of utility because Steel has so many resistances, which is always handy to have access to. Now, next pick in the draft. So, at this point in the draft, I had pretty much everything I wanted. There are definitely some things here which I could have drafted. I didn't draft a Water type. Which was an interesting situation for me to be in. But at this point, I had a bunch of options here. So I had 40 free points left in the draft, which means that I had a few different ways to go. If I opted into a lower tier Gmax option, like Machamp, for example, I would have gained extra points to get a non-tier 5 pick. But there wasn't really a tier 4 pick aside from Dracloak that I was really considering. In fact, I'm even going to look now. I'm curious to see what else was up that I could potentially have picked in tier 4. Because I remember looking in tier 4 and there wasn't too much that really excited me. Like, I was looking for, like, tier 4 waters, particularly. And even looking now, like, there's Golduck, which is not great for my team. I don't have a rain team. There's Auxiliary, which could be okay. Armorstar is more of a singles Pokemon. Relicanth is like, yikes. But yeah, like there wasn't really a tier 4 that I would have considered going for, particularly from a water type perspective. There are things like Cottony and Dubwall and you know, 2 of the Lycanrocs. Obviously Dusk Lycanroc is a little bit higher. There's things like Stunfisk Gala, which could be interesting as I have Psychic Terrain. There's things like Torracat, which is nice for Intimidate if I wanted to opt for that. So there are some okay tier 4 picks that are still left up. But the vast majority of them are picks that I wouldn't really draft. I guess there's Cramorant, which could be funny, but, you know, Cramorant's more of a meme. So I didn't really feel like I wanted to opt into a lower tier Gmax. So I opted into a tier 1 Gmax, which we'll talk about at the end, as that was my last pick of the draft. Which means that I had to pick 2 tier 5 Pokemon. So we'll talk about the one that's probably more relevant to my team, because at this point I didn't really consider too many options. But we drafted Munchlax. And Munchlax is a really fun pick. Obviously, it is more specially bulky, whereas the rest of my team is obviously fairly physically bulky with things like the Torkoal and the Steelix, so grabbing a little bit of special bulk doesn't go amiss, especially with that IHP stat. And this is actually really interesting, because for a not fully evolved Pokemon, it actually has insane special defense, which is nice. And of course, I can give this thing an Eviolite. So if I don't need to run Eviolite on something like Dracloak, for example, I can run it on Munchlax instead, which is actually really nice to buff up that physical defense. Much like Steelix in a way, it does get access to Curse, so I can slow this thing all the way down. Of course, we have 5 base speed, which is also a Trick Room option to pair up with Indeedee. And that definitely gives us some nice extra support. Of course, I can also speed swap and make this thing the fastest Munchlax on the planet, which is somewhat kind of amusing to me. I might kind of want to do that at some point if I can. But yeah, this thing is actually a pretty interesting pick for a tier 5. I think this actually fits my team really, really well. I can definitely play around this. Thick Fat is kind of an okay ability, because fire and ice moves are relatively common in the format right now, particularly with a lot of ground types like Lando T becoming very, very popular at the moment. So, yeah. Having access to ways to cover for ice moves. Also, things like Thundurus doesn't appreciate ice moves. Lilligant doesn't appreciate ice moves either, and neither does Dracloak, so having things that can deal with the ice moves, like the Pheromosa and the Torkoal, and having Munchlax that can freely switch in on it, feels pretty nice. So it's a nice option to have. This definitely fits my team in a way. And for a tier 5 pick, it's a very niche pick. It may come to a game or two, but it's probably unlikely that it's going to come, given how good the rest of my team actually is. But who knows? It might have a place. I think there's a couple of matchups, looking at some of the teams that this would be good for. So yeah, we'll see. Now, the next pick, I'm not gonna lie, people criticized me for this one, but I had to pick this, and this was a pure hate draft, so I sniped it. But we drafted Coughing. Now, the reason I took Coughing here is because, one, it's a tier 5 pick. It's a tier 5 pick with Neutralizing Gas, which feels pretty nice. But also because Dad's Rye drafted Regigigas, and for some bizarre reason did not draft one of the Weezings, he drafted Crobat instead. So, looking at this, and I'm like, well, I had a free pick in my draft that I didn't necessarily need anything for, because even looking in tier 5, like, the tier 5 waters didn't really appeal to me too much. I guess the closest thing that really did appeal to me was Palpitoad. But, like, I don't know, Palpitoad being quad weak to grass kind of really caused me some problems, although I do have Torkoal Thundy, so probably could have picked that if I was actually trying. But nonetheless, this pick actually can be viable on this team. Obviously, as a Levitate user as well, it can actually help me out a little bit there. It can give me a ground switch in, because things like Steelix and Torkoal don't appreciate ground moves. Obviously, Thundurus is going to be the main ground answer, but nonetheless, this can be viable on this team. It has passable physical bulk, but it is just not necessarily bulky enough. Obviously, it's slow, so I could even potentially run this as a Trick Room offensive mon if I felt like it, but its offensive stats is mediocre. So I wouldn't necessarily go for that. But this was a takeaway from Dad's Ride. It's kind of really weakened his Regigigas pick, which is, you know, as controversial as it might sound, this is actually relatively common draft strategy as well. If you can see a pick that your opponent needs, and it has somewhat of a niche pick on your team, and you have the room to draft it, you might as well pick it. Because if you can weaken your opponent's teams, you end up with a better matchup for yourself. So, you know, as much as people might think it's kind of fucked and whatever, that's totally fine. I don't care. I picked this anyway because I want to weaken my opponent's teams to give myself a better matchup. Simple as that. Which leaves my G-Max. And the last pick of the draft as a whole, of course. And this one was a fun choice for me, because as it comes back round to me, everybody had already picked their G-Max, because even before my 2 tier 5 picks, the Munchlax and the Coughing, everybody else had picked their G-Maxes. So I saved it for the last pick because I didn't need to worry about it. And I was toying with 3 different Pokemon in my head. Initially I was gonna consider opting for Snorlax, but I'm not a huge fan of G-Max Snorlax. I don't like its max move. I prefer Max Strike. So that's the reason I didn't opt for it. I feel like if its move actually always gave you its berry back, it would be better, but it's only 50% chance to get your berry back, and it's like, I I don't know how I feel about that. I'd rather just have a harder hitting back strike, you know what I mean? So I opted against Snorlax in the end. I was looking at Hatterene, of course, because I have the Indeedee, so Indeedee Hat is a pretty well-known duo in VGC, but I feel like that was a little too obvious, so I actually opted to give myself a little bit more utility. As I said, with the first 5 picks of the draft, we had a lot of offensive power already, and I didn't really want to kind of be too hyper-offensive. I do like my teams to be somewhat well-rounded and balanced. So I opted for G-Max Grimmsnarl. Grimmsnarl is a very interesting Pokemon in general, even without the G-Max. So as you can see, this thing actually has good offensive stats, but it also has Prankster as well, which is also a nice pair to work with things like Thunderous. With moves like Spirit Break, crippling your opponent's special attack and actually doing damage is kind of nice. But this thing gets a lot of utility options, gets things like Screens, gets Scary Face, gets Fake Tears, gets Thunder Wave, gets Taunts, it gets Fake Outs. It gets a lot of things that are really useful to it. So even if I don't choose to max this, and given how many good max targets I have on my team, it is highly possible I don't tend to max this very often. But even if I do opt to run this thing offensively, it gets good coverage moves like Power Whip and stuff like that. So I can definitely work around this Pokemon, and I'm pretty excited to give this thing a go as a max option. It may come as a G-Max target, who knows. I'll have to see if I can build it in and around that. But yeah, I think it's a good pick for this team. I think it gives the much needed support that this team can offer. Because this thing has a lot of power output, and I want to make sure that I can support that power as best as I can. Grimmsnarl gives me all the extra utility that I need in. It gives me a Dark type as well, so it gives me a Prankster status move switching, which is always nice. Shoutouts to Saiyan Senior that didn't realize you couldn't Prankster T-Wave or Weavile last season. Hashtag memes. But yeah, this thing gives me some options, so let's see what I can do with it. But yeah, that is going to be the team. That is what we're rocking with. So we do have 4 free agency swaps throughout the season. I don't know if I'm going to change too much, to be honest. I actually really like this draft. So we'll see. But let me know what you think about the draft down below. I'm excited to hear from you, of course. But as always, thank you so much for watching. My name is Robombi Teacher. I'm your coach of the Royal Bournemouth Robombis. Stay safe. Stay awesome. And I'll catch you guys in the next one. Take care.